Welcome to the So What from BCG, the podcast that explores the big ideas shaping business, the economy, and society. CEOs have always been under pressure, but right now that pressure is running high, clinically high. More than 70% of CEOs report being under chronic stress, the kind that undermines decision-making in high-stress environments. The BCG CEO Insomnia Index, based on a survey of more than 500 CEOs, found the what behind that stress was performance, growth, and costs. The who might surprise you more. It's not shareholders, investors, or the media, but it's much closer to home. The board, employees, and the people closest to them. Today, I'm joined by Judith Wallenstein, Global Lead of BCG CEO Advisory Practice, and Christine Barton, BCG CEO Advisory Lead for North America. Welcome to you both. Christine, CEOs are reporting very high levels of stress right now. What does that actually do to decision-making at the top, and has it gotten worse?
So in role, I would say what stress does is it narrows creativity. It dampens imagination. It narrows your ability to seek input. I think the other thing that's disturbing is that if enterprise level twos or even more junior tenures look up, if you watch a CEO and you see that level of overload or that level of cognitive overload, that level of stress, it dampens the interest in the role, which I know we covered on Who Wants to Be a CEO.
Judith, just tell me more, if you would, about the findings of this report. What is driving the stress for CEOs? One respondent said they were the emotional shock absorber, in that all stakeholders expect the CEO to fix everything as it relates to them. What's different? What surprised you from this report?
Geordie, you said it before. I think the fact that the people or the constituents closest to home stress you most, I don't think that's surprising in itself. I think what is surprising, how CEOs talk about the change. And we've just launched the Insomnia Index, as you rightfully said. We're very curious to see how that data series is going to evolve over time. But if you look at what Christine and I do for a living, we see roughly shy of 1,000 CEOs each year, and we see them in individual programs, so often over quite a long period of time, be that candidates or brand new CEOs. And then we see them in small group CEO learning communities of 15 to 25 peers in a room. And I think what they would be describing when you go back to the stressor groups you mentioned, and let me probably start with the board. The board has always been important for CEOs, but what has clearly changed is the pressure on boards that translate into pressure on the CEO.
It's not surprising the board's a top stressor. I mean, they have the power to evaluate or compensate, replace, publicly put their finger on the scale of the CEO's reputation. So it is a group, a stakeholder that looms kind of large. Interestingly, for public companies, boards were lower, or it was large cap companies. Boards are a little bit lower in terms of their stressor.
Were you surprised, though, Christine, that other areas didn't rank higher, by which I mean shareholders, investors, the media even? I say that as a journalist, but was that not a surprise to you?
It was a surprise to me, particularly in terms of shareholders and in terms of the media both. I would have thought both of those would be much higher. So I'm personally very interested to see how that evolves over time.
Were the findings, Judith, universal across regions and company size?
So look, you see spikiness, Georgie, in a number of dimensions. Not all CEOs are equally stressed, right? You also see that companies that are privately owned or have a very large family shareholding part of their investor base. Some of that pressure doesn't translate as directly as in large public companies. I still think there's a very big common ground, and we spoke about the board a bit. Probably moving to the senior leadership team, which was another one of those stressors.
One respondent said, "People on my C-suite do not live up to my high expectations. Now, what to do with them?"
You don't have the patriarchal leader anymore in the person of the CEO whom a senior leadership team will simply expect to follow. Right? I mean, if you look at today's highly competent, highly engaged executive teams, they very much share that conviction with many of their CEOs to say the CEO's plan needs to be a shared plan. You need to have everyone pull in the right direction to move the company forward. I'm always in awe, frankly, at the effort CEOs have made on top of business as usual, if you'd like to call it that way, to upskill themselves on AI, upskill themselves on geopolitics. And in a way, they need an executive team where they would hope that every single team member is better than themselves in an aspect and are investing the same amount of effort in upskilling themselves on their gaps.
I'm wondering, you mentioned there, Judith, that we don't have the same sort of patriarchal construct that perhaps we did in the past when it comes to CEOs. But there is still, doubtless, an element of you are the leader. And Christine, I'm wondering whether it's almost the stress of keeping silent about your stress is a stress itself.
I certainly think it could be. I think the other thing that I would turn to is, particularly if you're a CEO that processes externally through constructive challenge, through dialogue. When you're a CEO, you can't do that as openly with your executive team without the potential for creating a lot of unintended work or a lot of unintended waste. And so what I think happens is, particularly extroverted CEOs probably start to remove themselves from sources of energy, certainly sources of constructive dialogue and debate that actually help them process. So that's one. I mean, two, I also think we hear, Judith, I know because we've talked about it in every one of our sessions with CEOs, we hear people say, it's lonely. And I think part of it is they are not protecting time for reflection, which would help with some of that, loneliness, maintaining peer networks, which would help with that.
Tell me more about that.
You'll hear Frank Blake talk about the inverted pyramid. So if you think about the CEO at the bottom, which is a great metaphor for servant leadership. It brings up for me kind of the image of Atlas with the world on the shoulders.
And Christine, if I may, I'd love to come back to something you just said when you said, look, why is it lonely? Because and it often feels even more brutal for internal successions to CEO, which are 80% nearly of CEO successions globally. And it's logical because they're the lower risk. In general, they're lower risk for the board because you're selecting a CEO who's a known quantity. But what happens is you move from a peer to moving the boss of the shop, to being the boss of the shop. And everyone who crosses the threshold to your office has an agenda, if you like it or not. And that might be that they may want to oversell the results, they may want a promotion, they may want to download something on you that they're aggrieved with because you might do something about it. So it's very difficult to get feedback that's not self-interested. And what Christine and I see many CEOs do is that very quickly they aim to identify the two, three confidants in the organization. If I look at my industry in pharmaceuticals, I have a number of times seen CEOs pick these incredible, very senior scientists in their organization, people who had shown strong business judgment, not just strong lab bench strength over time. So they were much less likely to give a story that was advancing their own cause, and whom the CEO would often call upon to say, what do you think about this portfolio move? What do you think about this molecule? People who had that intellectual liberty to say, this is way too risky a move, and let me tell you why. And these people are really tough to find inside the organization.
How do you do that?
First, I would very mindfully practice cognitive or applied empathy. And what that is, that's not emotional mirroring empathy. That is seeking to understand points of view biases, motivations, ambitions, how you expect somebody to respond and why. In fact, I had a CEO that would describe, at least in her leadership team, that she insisted that every leadership team member know what the other leadership team member is likely to respond. So she might say, Georgie, if you are the CEO, Christine, what do you think Judith would say to that? And I would need to be able to say what I thought Judith's response would be, kind of, and why. So really practicing that cognitive empathy. One that is counterintuitive, or I don't know if counterintuitive is the right word, but probably not top of mind, genuine affection. So if you don't have genuine affection for your team members, you are not going to move in, or most people will not move into telling the hard truth, to holding team members mutually accountable. But Judith, what would you say to that?
I liked all your examples. Look, I mean, one of the biggest divergences we always hear is CEO goes to a town hall, runs the town hall, answers a couple of questions pre-selected by their comms team so that the CEO doesn't get the questions on why the new cafeteria menu is not good. And everyone walks out, pats each other's backs, and says to the CEO, fantastic performance. People loved you. And you would walk through the cafeteria and within 10 minutes hear that people absolutely thought that was a mediocre performance. And sadly, it's very difficult for CEOs to hear that feedback. So we work with CEOs who, for example, insist that every single town hall gets taped. And then they put this town hall, that tape in front of literally their mentor, their wife, their husband, their children, who will then say, really, mummy, you think this was great? And I think you need to hear that from people who are a bit further from the machine you're running every day.
I'm still smiling at the idea of showing children what you do. I'm still smarting from my niece calling all my social media sites boring. They are
Well,
ruthless.
that's at least they didn't call it embarrassing. I think you felt
I
well.
mean, that might have come next if I'd have waited long enough. But I did think that was interesting. One of the respondents saying that the feeling that you are alone in your decision making and there is no one to validate you, but importantly, to challenge you as well. What are your thoughts, Judith?
Georgie, given the number of stressors, and we haven't talked about employees in detail, who are another one of these groups.
Judith, you just mentioned employees. They are a big stressor. Just explain what's changed in that dynamic there. And again, what CEOs can do for a better relationship.
Georgie, I think you can take the very long-term review, right, perspective, which is the expectations of employees to hear a lot, to hear about the company's direction, to hear about its successes, to hear about its challenges from the CEO, from the horse's mouth, has gone up a lot. That needs to land with every employee. And often it's not easy to cascade that same message through this middle management layer. So thus, many CEOs feel they have to have a lot more direct contact with the employees. And then last, if you look at all the trust data that's around, with the decline of trust in traditional institutions, the employer and the person leading the company I work in actually is becoming a lot more relevant. And in a way, you could argue that puts nearly unfulfillable expectations on the CEO also to take a position on every single cause, be it global or very local, that employees really care about.
One of the unique roles that CEOs play rather, is really about how do you build belief? How do you build real optimism? How do you generate energy? So the chief energy officer, and also accountability, but really, how do you infuse the culture and the organization with these motivating factors, with this optimism, with this energy? And that takes a lot of energy and intention from the CEO.
Looking into these findings, Christine, the CFO seen as the biggest threat to CEO job security. Now, I want to be a bit clear on what do we mean. Do we mean taking their jobs or them not doing the best job and therefore putting the CEO under more pressure?
Once you have a sector or an enterprise that is under performance pressure, exposed to more volatility, geopolitical or technological advancements, one where there is distance between the shareholders and management, and therefore activist investor risk, you do see the CFO to CEO pathway more prominent there. And in that instance, it could be more about their actual job. I think I want to believe more likely what they are saying is performance is, necessary and insufficient for me to stay as CEO. And so I am in this very tight partnership with my financial partner in terms of delivering total shareholder return, or in financially sponsored companies, delivering the value creation thesis. That CFO role is one that, not surprisingly, there needs to be strong agreement, strong partnership between the CFO and the CEO in delivery.
Georgia, I'd really like to emphasize one thing Christine said. I don't think job poaching, in a way, the CFO wanting to become the next CEO is the core risk. But obviously, your CFO, beside you as the CEO, is the person with the closest relationship to the board, with most presence. If you're what I would call the glossy CEO, right, who leaves the hard numbers, the dialogue on cost, on capital allocation to their CFO, you easily look like you don't have a really deep grip on the business. I think actually as a CEO, you're starting to undermine yourself, and hence your CFO is becoming dangerous. But I think it's all your own doing in a way.
How do you get that balance right, though? How do you navigate that relationship so everybody knows their place?
I think in good CEO CFO relationships, everyone does know their place, right? Because as a CEO, basically being able to competently and quantitatively talk about the main value drivers of the business, and then showing that you have a very, very competent CFO who's literally able to address the questions of all the capital markets constituents in quite some detail. For me, that is a actually good role distribution. I think the other part is you want people to talk about risk in a very balanced way, right? It's not that all the discourse on risk should be with the CFO, while the CEO has given this over-optimistic view of the world.
One area that Judith was talking about earlier, and you've actually both mentioned it, is the board. How do you navigate that?
The way that I encapsulate that investment in the board, CEO or management board relationship is, you don't need the board until you need the board. And so you'll have wanted to invest in how they're going to show up for you in times of crisis, even if you're not optimizing what they can do for you outside of crisis. And I do think there's some other things, as you know, Judith, that we recommend. So I continue to be surprised how varied onboarding of new board members is. And that's not solely the CEO or management's responsibility, but I do think they have, a vested interest in doing that well, because you really want board members who are rooted in your context, really making sure that you're educating and helping upskill board members to the best use of them in terms of the partnership.
What does all of this mean that we've been discussing today in this report for how CEOs should be spending their time and attention differently? What next immediate steps can they take to ensure that they are the best that they can be for the role? Judith?
I'd say start with taking yourself seriously, being thoughtful about how do I show up the best I can for the company I'm leading, because my role matters. And that means not being overly stressed, not being in that red zone where decision making is clouded. So if that means you need another round of thinking about the topic, if that means telling your office and your assistant that no, you cannot have 25 one-on-ones of 35 minutes each on your calendar a week, that just simply doesn't work. Or if that is basically saying, what is the very structured time I need to sleep, to work out? One of the big changes we're seeing, if you ask about the now what in CEOs today, there's an HBR research from 2018 where American CEOs slept on average 6.9 hours a night. In our individual programs, we ask that question nearly every single time. This whole thing of, I can do in 4 hours and be great, that's really gone. The number of CEOs who tell us between 6 and 7 hours, but even between 7 and 8 hours, is quite astounding. And I think that whole notion that leaders need to take care of themselves and they can't just soldier through, and they just can't live under the illusion that when they're stressed and worn out and tired, they're as good leaders as if they were in better shape. That's already a huge step and a big driver for change. And then highly disciplined time allocation and understanding that your time is your most precious resource you can give to the company. And that means there are people and topics on which you would love to spend time, but you cannot.
Oftentimes, when I hear a COO to CEO talk, they will also often talk about feeling guilty about stepping back from the day to day or stepping back from the operational grind. The CEO role is the place of vision, it's the place of ambition, it's the place of strategy, it's the place of distortion of resources, of generating capacity, of creating optimism, belief, and accountability. And that requires that you get out of the brain that is in that linear, high executive functioning decision making so that you can be more expansive, you can open the aperture, you can be more creative, you can be more imaginative. And that doesn't happen without protecting the time.
Christine, Judith, fantastic advice for everyone, CEOs or not, you've just delivered there. But thank you, an absolute pleasure. And thank you for joining us. You can find the report that we've just been talking about, the BCG Insomnia Index, what and who is keeping CEOs up at night, via the link in our show notes.